Many people think that the war in between Israel and Hamas has kind of turned into a sort of a static situation here, just to kind of a lot of just fighting near and there, dropping bombs, and things are kind of on a steady state. The truth is, however, things are on the rise, and in fact could be reaching a boiling point, and the region and the war could be ready to explode. Wall Street Journal had a piece this morning actually out on that very issue. And as the issue is not merely the war itself, though that is also on the potential, but also on the diplomatic front between Netanyahu and Biden himself. And we've got somebody really good to help us break this down today. One of your favorites, Jason Beardsley, former Green Beret and director of vetting issues at Stand Together, former senior Trump advisor. So this is going to be a good one here. And Jason, glad to have you back.
Boy, it's great to be with you. And once again, you put us right on the horns of a dilemma with such an easy topic to deal with, right? Our allies,
right,
or the president's administration, how they deal with really tough conflicts on the ground. So I'm ready to roll in, but it's a good thing I wore my camouflage shades. It's about to get dirty.
Yeah. We'll have some return fire coming after this one. We'll see how that works out there. But one of the things I love about this show is that we love to put things in context. So as sometimes on the major media, just because of their format, you may have a 3.5 minute segment. Or you may hear somebody quoted here making 45 to 50 seconds worth of an explanation, and then they're moving on to the next subject here, and you're kind of left off and scratching your head. Well, we're going to show you some real context today to make sure you understand that this situation is very volatile. It could expand in some ways that are not good for us on both the diplomatic and the actual military fronts. So first of all, I want to start off between the potential conflict between Biden and Netanyahu to show you that there are some increasing space between the two. Now, Biden from the outset was like literally hand in glove with Netanyahu. Whatever Netanyahu said, Biden was in full support because of the horrific events that happened on the 10/7. Of course, in our own 9/11 history, we were enthusiastically behind Israel because they were subjected to this horrible terrorist strike that, slaughtered so many civilians in their country. And everybody understands the right of self-defense. Things started to cause a little bit of distance, though, when the way that Israel was going about their business and about how they're going after the terrorist Hamas, because they were killing so many innocent civilians in the process and starting to cause problems for the U.S., both in the Red Sea and in Iraq and in Syria, where our troops are, which we've covered extensively. But now then the issues are even going more strained, and now Israel is on the verge of attacking into the last large stronghold of civilian population into a place called Rafah, which is right on the border with Egypt. Now, in case you're not familiar, that ordinarily Rafah is a medium-sized city of about 250,000, but because of everybody having been forced out of their homes in the other part of the Gaza Strip, right now it's well over 1 million people stuffed into there. And Netanyahu has been telling people that he's going in there. We'll talk about that in a minute. But the problem is to where? Where are they going to go? Some people want them to go out of the Rafah gate and into Egypt and to have the problem solved. Egypt's not playing that game so far. And Sisi and Erdogan of Turkey have been having lots of confabs about that. So that's getting more tense between squeezing Israel in between the two. But now then, Biden himself is starting to say, okay, hang on. We're not just going to go down this path here, because that could cause an absolute catastrophe of extraordinary proportions, even more than what we've seen so far. If Israel goes into this attack in Rafah without some major changes on how they conduct their business. A couple of days ago, the king of Jordan was in Washington to talk about this very issue, and Biden had this to say.
King and I discussed today the United States is working on a hostage deal between Israel and Hamas, which would bring an immediate and sustained period of calm to Gaza for at least 6 weeks, which we could then take the time to build something more enduring. The King and I also discussed the situation in Rafah. As I said yesterday, our military operation in Rafah, the major military operation in Rafah, should not proceed without a credible plan for ensuring the safety and support of more than 1 million people sheltering there.
But if you've been paying any attention at all, you see that that seems to be falling on deaf ears with Netanyahu, because here's one of many places where he said yeah, about that.
Victory is within reach. We're going to do it. We're going to get the remaining Hamas terrorist battalions in Rafah, which is the last bastion, but we're going to do it. And in this, I agree with the Americans. We're going to do it while providing safe passage for the civilian population so they can leave. We're not cavalier about this. This is part of our war effort to get civilians out of harm's way. It's part of Hamas's effort to keep them in harm's way. But we've so far succeeded, and we're going to succeed again. Those who say that under no circumstances should we enter Rafah are basically saying, lose the war, keep Hamas there.
So Netanyahu's tying himself to this premise that if we don't go into Rafah, we lose the war. That's just it. That's how it's going to be. No matter what Biden says, no matter what Hussein says, no matter what El-Sisi in Egypt, no matter what Erdogan, no matter what anybody says, he seems to be going down that path. The question I got for you, Jason, is to what extent do you think that whether it's Netanyahu or others in his government may have calculated that, look, I understand that a lot of people aren't going to like this, but this is our golden opportunity to rid this problem once and for all. And even though we know it'll cause a lot of problems, I'll give lip service to saying, yeah, we're going to do what you want, but we're actually going to go on the ground and do whatever we want, and then we'll ask forgiveness later, kind of thing. Or do you think that Netanyahu may actually be restrained by what Biden is talking about here?
So, number one, it's a really good question, because we don't have all the information, and we're not sure. This is one of those cases the Americans are treated with all the time with foreign policy, where the devil is in the details, and the details are everything here. If, for example, the prime minister has a plan that we're not aware of, or we wouldn't know, it'd be very hard to support that, because the overtones of this suggest urban combat in a hyper-dense population. I've been in the Gaza Strip. I've been in the West Bank. These are not comfortable places to conduct combat operations within. And as a soldier on the ground, how difficult that is. You have multiple prongs, whether it's infantry, mechanized, you have air. But what that means is, he said it. You heard in the clip what Netanyahu said was that Hamas integrates the civilian population with the leadership and the core and the cadre and the military elements of their military sort of wing. And so separating the two is not easy to do. And when we've seen massive scale ground combat in urban terrain before, it is very, very difficult. I mean, we have to look back to World War II in our own units and soldiers to understand what that looks like. Or you can look at Ukraine and Russia now, places like Mariupol or Kherson, where you see entire places devastated by artillery and constant bombardment, and people sheltering in sort of underground hovels, waiting for the next shoe to drop, so to speak. And then it becomes about mass on mass, force on force, shooting, from house to house. And when you're doing that with a large population of civilians, boy, unless he's got some tricks up his sleeves we haven't heard of, this probably presents for him a very realistic sort of challenge. Do you want to do this? And if so, are you ready for the blowback on what may occur? And what I'd caution Americans in is we don't have to tie ourselves inherently to other people's foreign quagmires. We have a lot of support in our country, and have been consistent about our support for Israel's defense in general, along with Jordan, along with Saudi Arabia. So we're on all sides of this conflict. It's very important that we don't get too close to the things that we can't account for on the battlefield. It's hard enough to do it with U.S. forces. It's going to be even harder to do that with a proxy ally who's at war in a very difficult region. I don't envy the president.
Now, one of the biggest challenges is for the people on the ground, and even for the United States, and wanting to try to tie some of our aid to actually humanitarian support, is where would they go if Netanyahu goes in, and literally could come any day now, if based on the preparation they've been talking about. Where would the people go? Because he said, there's safe corridors. And in one interview I saw, they can go to the north in some of the cleared areas. Really? What's cleared in the north? And where would you go in the north? Because there's still Israeli forces there, and they're still fighting in probably what's the beginning of a guerrilla war, even in their back, because they haven't fully cleared out even Gaza City, where all of this started 4 months ago. So that's the first question, is where would these people go? You may remember in the first part, when in fact they had first gone into the northern part of Gaza City, that there was these lot of pictures of these large streams of just a massive humanity walking down major boulevards, moving down to the south in Rafah, etc. Well, those areas are now shattered. So the question would be, where would they go?
This is the problem, is that, man,
The lane stretch.
we really don't have the details here. And so it's incumbent upon the prime minister to really understand or unfold or articulate for our president what the veracity of his confidence level is, if he has a means to, let's say, repatriate or expedite or facilitate the safe passage of these civilians. If we don't hear that, President Biden has to be very cautious. And I think that's what you're seeing. And watching him stand there with the King of Jordan tells you that right now they're very concerned about what happens next. And again, I don't envy the president, but this is where leverage, this is where years of allied friendship come into play, and putting the pressure on Netanyahu at this stage is correct. Again, we don't know what's happening in their dialogue behind closed doors, but if the president of the United States doesn't have confidence that Israel can do this without sort of massive problems, if he doesn't have that confidence, then he's right to stand up and sort of push back.
And look, I mean, let's just look at this from a military perspective at the tactical level, first of all. So it has always made sense that when the Israeli Defense Forces went in the north, they started moving people south. On that great clip that Gary just showed there, obviously there's no vetting going on. So the idea that all of those men that were in those pictures are just, dudes and families trying to escape the war, or some of the Hamas figures in there, of course, that we knew it's virtually certain that they were intermingled. And since there's no uniforms, who can say who is anybody? So naturally, a lot of them would flee the fighting and go down further into the south. But now then the problem is, if you say, yes, sure, just go back to the north, and you have similar floods of people going back that, unless you have some sort of vetting station, or people have to and I don't know how you would even do that, even theoretically, but there's no even discussion of that, meaning that there would unquestionably be more Hamas figures mixing in with those folks, leaving back into the north, and then you'd be spread it out. So you're not actually going to militarily accomplish what Netanyahu claimed in that clip that he wants to, which is to get the final battalions. So really the question is, what would he accomplish with this, even if he did it?
Yeah, again, there would be a question that it's incumbent upon Netanyahu to really articulate for his people, first, primarily the answer. And it's not different than what the United States has to deal with. The foreign policy military use cannot be one of emotion. It cannot be one of retribution or vengeance. It has to be one that has strategic concerns for the nation in mind. And one of the things that we have our own questions about is, how much do we put our forces in harm's way on the offensive versus the defensive, and at what times do we take the offensive? What you just outlaid, Colonel Davis, you saw it on the ground. The prospect of going into an urban conflict fraught with civilians and hazards at every stage. This is the worst kind of combat a soldier can undergo, and there is no prospect for quick answers here. If the prime minister thinks that he can exterminate or kill or capture the entire Hamas core, what you have to then count on is what happens to the people, the family members, those who support Hamas, those who maybe didn't support Hamas but now do. They're caught in the middle, but at the end of this type of a conflict, you usually don't resolve that problem. So the wiser prescriptions for foreign policy tend to be much more restrained, much more realistic. What can we do? What do we have? They've got borders. They're able to kind of defend that, the Iron Dome system. There's a lot of kind of tools, but if every tool they go to is an emotional one, and I understand that this was a tragic, as you said, terrorist ambush raid into Israel. The numbers of people that were slaughtered in this is horrifying. The problem is, what you cannot do is take that emotion and then apply tactics and strategy based on the emotion. You have to do those based on what you're given. And right now, this is not a situation I think he's ready for.
And I think to your point there, it's one thing to have an emotional desire based on the what you were attacked and you were suffering. But I remember something very relevant to this from my combat zone in 2011, late 2011. I went into the Kandahar province, into the Arghandab River Valley. to where one of the American units had just cleared a section of that. And of course, the idea was we were trying to clear the Taliban out of this whole area there, the whole valley, so that the civilian population could come in and actually live, and we were supporting them, et cetera. And I remember joining this unit in setting up the new forward defensive position. And they had just taken a building complex away from the Taliban the day before I got there. And so now then they were actually setting up machine gun nests that had, and getting their fields of fire cleared out. And there was I guess it was a wheat field or barley, one of those crops there that was being farmed in front. And I remember as I was going up and watching the setup of the machine gun nest, I looked out to my distance here and we could see it was 5 dark colored figures standing in the middle of the wheat field at maybe 700-800 meters away. So it was close enough that you could tell they were people, but not close enough you could tell who they were. And so I actually got my basically my scope for my rifle and was looking a little closer at them, and you could see that they were guys just sitting there. They're just standing like 5 of them, and just sort of like this in their little heads picking up. And I asked the guys, because that was their sector, and I asked them, "Hey, are those Taliban or are those somebody else?" Because they're just standing there, and they go, "We don't know. I mean, tonight those very same guys could come and attack us. We really aren't certain." Or they could just be farmers and just wondering what's going on. We literally have no idea, no way to know. And so I that struck me that even the guy standing there could literally be shooting at us later tonight, but we can't just kill them because they may be the very people we're supposed to be protecting. And of course, when we do that, as your point just a second ago, all of their family members would be then against us because they would have to, be revenge or whatever. The key point, though, is that after I left that and redeployed back to the U.S., it was about 6 months or so later that we withdrew from there. And of course, the Taliban rolled right back in. It was as though we were never there. So all of those operations were pointless because there was bad guys. In this situation, I think is hypersensitive to that because so many people innocent people had been killed. Just imagine these. I think the reports are, Jason, somewhere around 70% or so of these 29,000 Palestinians who have been killed are women and children. Now, what does anyone think that the male surviving members of those families, the fathers, the brothers, the uncles, are going to do in response to that? Are they going to say, darn it, I mean, collateral damage? What do you do, right? It happens in war. Well, hopefully we can live in peace from now, and that's what we're going to do. They're going to be filled with rage and anger. Even if they're not called Hamas, they're still hating Israel and want revenge on that. So militarily, I see literally zero prospect that Israel can accomplish its goals no matter how they conduct this operation.
When you personalize these things the way you did, and I'm in these very same situations, that I think the audience really deserves, walking into the granular of what you're talking about. It's houses I've been in on raids in places like Iraq where daughters that, 9 years old are probably innocent, but they're holding or hiding IED equipment that their father, doesn't want to be caught with. And you have to literally look in the face and the eyes of what is sort of, we'll call it the civilian, underbelly of the military, and understand how intimate they are with the population. So the risk that you're talking about, the long-term risk of engendering more and more violence, does not go away as these tactical operations go up. And so if the strategy, that's the big thinking picture, what happens after you kick in the doors and, wrestle down every one of these bad guys, kill or capture them, the strategy is what happens in the long term? How do we live, as you said, as neighbors? And what is the most comity we can apply for these two populations? They're already embittered. They've already established that neither population is very comfortable with the other. We'll use that term. But in the end, if you can't change that calculus, then you have to make a decision about what your tactical operations will do in the strategical environment. And in the strategic environment, the political environment, the diplomatic environment, if these operations are meant to curb or quell or stop that, then we have a history to look at of counterinsurgency, counter-guerrilla warfare, whatever you want to call it, counterterrorism, to determine, has that worked well so far? And if Americans aren't sure about that, I can give you 2 case studies right now that suggest that it's very difficult to do: Iraq and Afghanistan. And we had the benefit of not having to face what Netanyahu has to face
Yeah.
now, Israelis do, which is a very, very close quarters tight geography with very little room for maneuver and a ton of civilians sitting in the same quadrant, the same space, the same building that they're looking at having to fight house to house in. I'm not sure how they do this.
Yeah. And that's if it were only restricted to the tactical environment within Gaza, this would be an enormously difficult nut to crack. And I don't know either what Israel do. I mean, even if I said, all right, you know what, I'm going to tell. I get dictatorial power for 30 minutes, and I can tell Netanyahu anything I want, and he'll have to do it. Even if I had that kind of power, there's no good answer I could give Netanyahu, because what he should do, what I would actually say, is that you've got to stop this offensive right now, because all you're going to do is dig yourself an even deeper well from where you're in right now. But there's so much damage has been done. That's not going to bring peace anyway. I think that if you acknowledge that part right there, that this is going to be a multi-year issue to where you just need to try to make it stable so that it's some in the distant future, then you can have a shot at getting some peace if you get some wise people in there. That's one thing. But the problem for Netanyahu is that his problems are much bigger than inside the Gaza Strip. They're actually now outside. And I have been warning from the outset here that if Netanyahu causes too much damage and too many deaths on the Palestinian people inside the Gaza Strip, that he risks losing Western support. Now that's starting to materialize. So it's not just Biden who's starting to put some distance, but other of the most crucial allies that Netanyahu needs to continue this operation. And let me just show you a few from the last 48 hours, some of which were earlier today, that he is facing a bigger problem than he may think. First of all, I want to show you the from the Foreign Minister of Australia.
The Australian government's grave concerns about an impending major Israeli ground offensive in Rafah. This would bring further devastation to more than 1 million civilians seeking shelter in Rafah, many there by Israel's direction. Large-scale military operations in densely populated areas risks extensive civilian casualties. Australia believes this would be unjustifiable.
The Germans, who may have been probably the most reticent to say anything to Israel because of their role in the genocide of, during World War II and all of that, and the shame and the guilt that they have as a country, they've been reticent to say anything. But now, I believe it was yesterday, their foreign minister says this.
Many of them have followed the Israeli evacuation orders and fled the combat zones in northern Gaza, often with nothing more than their small children in their arms and the last of their clothes on. These people cannot simply vanish into thin air. If the Israeli army were to launch an offensive on Rafah under these conditions, it would be a humanitarian disaster in the making.
And then now the last one here I want to show is probably their biggest supporter militarily and diplomatically, and that is the UK. And in Parliament, this exchange took place.
You've got to have a new Palestinian Authority government in place. You've got to give the Palestinian people a political horizon to a better future and a two-state solution. And crucially, you've got to release all of the hostages and do that very quickly. She asked whether we challenge the Israel government over individual episodes. Yes, we absolutely do. I've done that personally with them over, for instance, a building that was bombed that had UK medics and other charities in.
So he went on to say that he has personally talked about, Netanyahu and conveyed, that's the Foreign Minister Cameron for the UK, that, look, I've got some real problems with this. That's what they're saying publicly. I can't imagine what may be going on behind the scenes as you're talking about. But one of the reasons I love having you on our show, Jason, is because of your ability to see the bigger picture, not just the tactical stuff, but, how this stuff fits together. When you see Australia, Germany, France, and now the United States, in addition to like King Jordan in the region, El-Sisi, Erdogan, that's, their neighbors in there. When you see this now growing coalition of people moving further and further away from Israel, where do you see this going, and what does Netanyahu need to be careful of?
Well, first of all, I think this was always going to be the case, right? I mean, from the moment October 7th takes place, there is sort of a recognition, I think, by many that the time that Israel has to act is a window of opportunity. They had a window that would exist in the sort of the right after the cusp of this, but it's not an open window forever. And so their actions are, the further they get away from October 7th, harder to justify and define. We ran into the same thing with 9/11. Now, we were extended for reasons that are very administrative, but you'll notice that the actual cause, the war that you see, the sort of bombing of Baghdad or the big type of invasion stuff, that all stopped pretty quickly after the initial invasion. Then we ended up in a simmering sort of situation with logistics and basing, and we had presence patrols. So there were ways that we went from all full tilt, all scale war to something different than that. And Israel is going to be faced with the same thing. So what he's up against, the consequence is, at this stage, he's lost a lot of time to do something extraordinary. I think we can say that he's already taken significant actions. And so if you're sitting there in charge of this thing, it's that time you need to start thinking about, how do we moderate next and then move to the next stage of this conflict. It is a conflict. It's been ongoing. It's not going to stop. So we're never going to be done with these two factions warring against each other. But nobody wants to get dragged down into that. The United States doesn't, Germany, as you saw, doesn't, Jordan doesn't, Turkey doesn't. Meanwhile, we're having to now fight sort of Iran proxy wars on the periphery because, of course, Iran is supporting the Hezbollah and Hamas elements within this. So they're establishing regional simmering proxy wars in order to really drag the West in and suck our resources down. It's now up to the Pentagon and the White House to determine, do we leave troops in harm's way, or do we do the smart thing and now start taking advantage of our military positioning? All of that, it all fulcrums or like levers on what happens in Gaza. And if the Israelis don't do something smart here in the next month, the window's over. I mean, even right now, it's starting to close on them. So this is the time to shift into the next stage. It's not going to end the conflict, but at this stage, most Western countries are not going to be able to justify the type of operations that you might have seen, let's say, within October or even as late as November. It's a little late for those.
I totally agree with that. And to the topic that we're talking about here is the potential for boiling over. It's not just between Biden and Netanyahu. It's not just between Israel and some of their closest regional and allied countries here, but it's also now threatening to potentially expand beyond the Gaza Strip, as this report here indicates.
IDF Chief of Staff Herzi Halevi says Israel's goal is to push Hezbollah back from the border and stop the attacks, and will go to war if necessary.
See, what with so much focus on Rafah, some people haven't been noticing in the northern part that there has been some recent significant escalation in the attacks, which have been kind of on low simmer really since the beginning between the northern part of Israel and the southern part of Lebanon. But that took kind of a stronger tone here when Israel attacked into it just within the last 12 or so hours. And there was the largest loss of civilian life on the Lebanese side of any since this thing sparked up in October of last year, where 10 people were killed, I think 6 or 7 women and children. So the population's really upset there. You had Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, that says, hey, if Israel wants to expand this, we got that. We're going to do the same thing in return. So that now is getting more tense as well. And then, as we've shown several times, right now we're in a kind of a pause, a tactical pause potentially. And we actually had Mike Domino on earlier today explaining kind of how our troops in Iraq and Syria that you cited a second ago, there actually has been a lowering of the attacks in the last week or so, giving evidence that maybe these strikes had been effective in deterrent. Mike suggested that it's probably more like a tactical pause where they're trying to reassess what they're doing. The threat still remains, and as long as the troops are there, it remains. And as long as that happens, then we continue to have the risk of guys like General Kellogg. Gary, I didn't prep you for this, but if you could throw that one up there, that would be great, because that's one of my big concerns, is that still remains part of this boiling cauldron that could roll over into many in the United States wanting to launch an attack, into Iran itself. And if Hezbollah and Israel start to get into a war, even without any more Americans getting killed, that could also re-increase the spurs on Biden to expand the war into Iran, which would be, I think, catastrophic for our ends. But that's all the things that are going on bubbling. And do you have any experience or knowledge with the Hezbollah situation in the north?
Yeah, I mean that's a fraught with danger, precarious situation as you described. I mean, there's been a bit of a stalemate there for a while. Sort of a little bit of back and forth. There's always again simmering tensions right along the border, but as those tensions increase in response, whether it's to October 7th or whether it's to the operations in Gaza, that opens up vulnerabilities on the civilian population in the northern part of Israel, the Golan Heights. And bear in mind, the Lebanese government itself and Lebanon in general has had a long time history of proxies from Iran stirring up factional violence between the different groups there. So there's a lot of room for sloppy maneuvering in and around that situation that if this gets out of control, as you said, if it sort of ramps up, we can end up in I should say, Israel can end up in a really cycle of sort of bad news from one week to the next week to the next on multiple fronts that also jeopardizes our U.S. forces, which again, we are now having to kind of endure some of the stuff that is spilling over in the Middle East. These are all regional, but they're all related to the similar type of conflicts. Now, I love that, as you pointed out with Mike Domino, there's been a bit of a tactical pause. Potentially, it's also an opportunity for a window that is open because a lot of folks on both sides of this, whether it's Iran, the state, or Israel or the United States, they don't want an escalated war. That everybody said that. The question is, sometimes you get into those situations without wanting to be there. That's how we got to World War I and other places. So to stop that from happening, they have to be very deliberate. And right now, you can see the Biden administration attempting to be that deliberate, but we don't know how much credibility or viability he has with the Israeli government. So this is a tough situation. This is exactly when Congress needs to weigh in. This is where pressure comes from when we write these checks. When we just passed the sneaky Super Bowl night, Senate bill to throw another $95 billion at our foreign, aid without really questioning again. When you have the levers, when you have the diplomacy and you have economic strings that you can pull them. Instead of just willy-nilly writing these blank checks because you want to talk tough. When you talk tough like that, you got to know how to back it up. And soldiers for the last 20 years for American diplomacy have been backing up the tough talk in DC to our demise. We're the ones burying our friends in Arlington. We're the ones losing friends to alcoholism, suicide, broken families, right? So this is not a no-cost type of talk tough foreign policy for everybody that gets up there and pounds their fist on the podium. They should know that behind that, there are real people. Now, we volunteer for these missions, but the point is the constituents, the American constituents, have to be wise with our tax dollars and judicious with the use of force and not prone to give in to every emotional knee-jerk reaction out there.
You get back again to that same thing about the emotion driving actions and whatnot. And look, and I think that, Jason, we didn't talk about this, but I think you and I probably both agree that when it comes to the U.S. military and our national combat power, that in the event that it ever needs to be used for our defense, I am 100% enthusiastic and all for using powerful, overwhelming force to destroy any enemy that comes against the United States. I wouldn't have any hesitation doing that. But I'm all for using smart power and wisdom in our policy as opposed to this.
They have to do what I would call super escalate. They have to take it to a level that everybody's uncomfortable, including those in the Situation Room, where you go to a level you say, okay, this isn't a gamble. It's a risk, and we understand the risks involved. But until we make a clear message and we send a clear message, these are going to continue. So you have to go outside of your normal box, and you have to break the escalation ladder. Either attack the Quds Force leaders, that's Ismail Ghani, or the Supreme Leader Khamenei, or the facilities they've got in Iran, but somebody has to make a hard call, because now we've reached a point where we're going to have to do something very hard, very strong, and the response is going to be probably, but from their end, it could be proportionate. So be prepared for that.
Yeah, that always, this whole signal that he wants to be sending and talking about something that is an absolute outright act of war at the highest level as a message. And again, you talk about someone's bounding on the desk writing checks that you and me and other guys who are currently in service right now will have to pay that bill. That just drives me crazy.
Well, let me create the diplomatic bridge to bring us together with General Kellogg. Let's give him a little credit. super escalate, sure, but don't do it with military materiel and bodies. Do it with checks. And that's where, again, Congress, if you want to super escalate, start writing small checks. You don't, I mean, you can cut the whole thing off, sure, if you've got that kind of guts. But my point is, we talked about this last week with Mike Domino, or it was 2 weeks ago, but we're funding the Iraqi government. The Iraqi government takes those funds, hands them over to Iraqi Shia militia who are working for Iran, who then shoot at U.S. soldiers. We're buying the weapons that are used against us. So super escalate, sure, crazy, but do it in a clever way. You don't have to be, we don't have to get suckered into every bar fight. You know, we can select those better and maybe even run up the tab on our enemies instead of having to get into a fisticuffs every single time something happens. So I hear the sentiment. I'm with you 100%. But be clever as statesmen about it. You don't have to get sucked into a material force-on-force conflict for every time you want to take an action. You are writing checks. And by the way, we're coming up on April 15th. Guess who else is writing checks? I'm writing a check to the U.S. government. And I know that if you want, you can take that money and spend it on the domestic policies, secure the border, take care of Americans in these cities that are wrecked by fentanyl. You can actually buy some security on the domestic front and cut off the funding of our enemies and get a little bit of that sort of that sensitivity you want, where the Middle East starts to quell a little bit because we're not flooding every side of this conflict with our money.
That's just nonsense to me. And you know, it just boggles my mind that there's so many so willing to go to war on a war that does not need to be fought. There's no upside for us. If we go in and have a war with Iran, there is no upside for us. It's not as though that our forces are in the region or our assets are at risk that, oh my God, that any day Iran could shut us down and are going to kill our people if only, there's no evidence of that at all. Iran doesn't want a war. Hezbollah doesn't want a war. None of these people want a war. They all want to go back to some peaceful situation, which is why your point about having a strategic vision and diplomacy going in to try to handle these at the lowest level. We benefit when we solve problems at the lowest level, at the lowest cost, and the greatest benefit for America. Not go in, huge first and kill everybody and then draw us into a bigger problem.
And Colonel Davis, when some people are promoting these ideas, they're looking less for a full-on, full-scale war as much as they are looking for proxy wars, looking to stir up sentiments. And this is a classic, world state power technique. But if you look at how China does war on a different fronts. They look at economy, they look at education, they look at science, they look at tech, R&D. They're stealing patents every day. They're increasing their business profile, and they're stealing our commerce on the shipping lanes. That's war. That's real war. And what I'm suggesting is, yeah, okay, I got it. You want to make a strong stance, but the way we do that and keep the constituent in mind, bring back to the American public some wins, is we wage war in the multiple array of war tools that are at the disposal of the state, which again goes from diplomacy to economics to information to cyber to intelligence. There are other means. If we're stuck on stupid, hitting the let's get into the bar fight every single time, then we've just tried to build an entire house with just a hammer. We talked about it before. We need some different tools, some saws, and some whatever else you use. But we can't just go to the hammer every time.
Yeah, agreed. Well, listen, we'll go ahead and leave it there for right now. Thanks ever so much for coming on today and providing some clarity and some common sense on what we can do and illuminating the problem that we have. And hopefully Biden will apply some of these levers that we do have, some of the leverage we have, and some wisdom and some foreign policy. We'll see how that works out, and we'll keep having you back on. So thanks for joining us today, Jason.
Another easy topic and not fit for Sesame Street.
Right. Indeed, it's not. And we thank you guys for joining us too. We always value you, always value your comments. By all means, keep making them in there. We throw up several of them when we get a chance during this show because we always want to know what you think. And if you have specific questions, put those in the comment section there because we'd like to address some of those if we're not going in a direction where you want to know something is. So we value those. We watch them. We pay attention. So continue to doing that. You're going to want to join us tomorrow. We're going to have an insider info from what's going on the ground in the Russia-Ukraine war. Lots to talk about there. I think we're actually going to come back at 3 o'clock this afternoon on kind of an overall assessment. But on tomorrow, we're going to come back with Matt Van Dyke. We've had him on a few times because he's on the ground in Ukraine, has engaged in some direct fights in support of Ukraine. And he's also doing some stuff off the front lines of the battlefield. And we're going to get an update from him. Again, stuff you're not going to see anywhere else. So tune in tomorrow, and we'll see you next time on Daniel Davis Deep Dive.